Hi everyone, you're listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal, Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, coming to you from Colombo, and my guest today is the writer and filmmaker, Alina Gufran, joining us from Tokyo to talk about her debut novel, No Place to Call My Own. Before we dive in, I'd like to invite our listeners to check out Himal's Patreon program on our website, where you can pay just $5 a month to support our mission to give South Asian literature the spotlight it deserves. To make conversations like this possible, we need the support of our listeners like you. No Place to Call My Own is one of those rare novels that captures a generation with searing precision. Through Sophia, a young woman navigating life, failure, and painful self-discovery across cities, the novel tackles the complexities of displacement and thorny issues related to class, faith, sexuality, and economic anxiety. Sophia's journey is not just her own, but that of any woman who finds themselves caught in between, unable to back down and refusing to conform, and who doesn't quite feel rooted to one place or identity. Though the picture Alina Gufran paints of this generation may be grim, it will be immediately and uncomfortably relatable to anyone contending with what it means to belong in India today. Alina, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your new book.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stories with self-aware but chaotic and disillusioned millennial women protagonists are on the rise. Many of these characters, especially in recent South Asian literary fiction, are caught up in the messiness of late capitalist life. They are searching for meaning and belonging while trying to launch their careers, and it sometimes pushes them into these rabbit holes of general debauchery. And your novel really stands out in capturing this. The kind of ambient dread of 20-somethings shaped by economic precarity, the rise of right-wing nationalism, and your characters are dealing with class, money, ambition, and burnout, but not in the cliched way. Instead, there's a quiet realism. The protagonist, Sophia, isn't chasing some lofty ideal. She just wants to get by. So I wanted to start by asking, how does the novel speak to this generation and moment in India today?
I think a lot of what you said in the novel is born from the time that I was writing it. Because I think after the last decade of the country politically, for me specifically, came to head during the pandemic, which is around the time I wrote the novel. A lot of the things that had been kind of simmering in the background and bubbling up in the consciousness of the country, to me it felt like it just came to like a halting screech, but on the surface for everyone to see. It was kind of laid bare, right? Whether it was the migrant crisis or how COVID was handled, or the fact that a lot of people in their early to mid to late 20s were shut up inside their homes. I mean, apart from other people, but just speaking to that age for a second here, with really no sense of how things were going to play out. A lot of people were quarantining alone. Then, of course, there was a very pivotal moment of the Delhi riots, which is something that Delhi hasn't witnessed in a very long time. I mean, not in my lifetime at least, not Delhi as such, right? We can talk about neighboring areas and such. And there's something about something happening at that scale with that impunity in the capital and in a city that I call home that was very telling of the moment that we had truly arrived at, which I think a lot of people who are tuned in have been suspecting it and know about it. But the pandemic was a time where really you couldn't look away. It was no longer a turning of the tide. It was very much an arrival, right? And what truly felt, to me at least, dystopic. Also then, of course, set against this global health pandemic that was playing itself out, with all the news pouring in of systems failing across the world. So I think it was a pivotal time for everyone. Public memory is such that it's fickle. It wants to move past. We're in 2025 and we've sort of forgotten that time. And there's been like stories of revenge partying or revenge travel and so on. But for me, it sort of irrevocably changed the way I was, I don't know, contending with things in the country. It just became a lot more visceral. So it was a very natural thing for me to then put that preoccupation in my writing. I didn't really have to think too much about it. And I mean, a lot of it was obviously a very urgent response to what was happening because there was a certain sense of helplessness. And me being a writer, I couldn't think of sort of a better way of dealing with that helplessness, right? I don't know if it has any tangible effect, but it definitely is quite a selfish pursuit in that sense. And then initially, while it was an urgent response, the deeper I went into it, the more I could uncover sort of the signs or things leading up to it, the fallout actually of how it might affect a particular generation and how things might turn around for them. And I suppose that listlessness that Sophia possesses in this very particular manner, which is a result of a certain urban alienation, a certain sense of constantly not belonging, while she is perusing these circles which require like social capital to even get into, right? This comes from that very fact. In a very simple way, this idea of code switching, in a different sense, this idea that when you're aware of something more, but there's a certain paralysis and you can't do much about it. And from therein comes this sense of perhaps a certain sense of like self destructiveness or escapism or the need to kind of detach yourself from your current reality because of the cognitive dissonance of what exists, right? I mean, it can be illustrated really well, I think, in the age that we live in today, this hyper normal, sort of hyper real reality wherein if for the last 1 year, if I'm ever on Instagram, which I need to be for the book actually, I am switching between like news of the genocide to ads to so on, right? I mean, I think that dissonance has very much permeated beyond social media. It's kind of fragmented. To me, it feels like the consciousness of any 20 something who is a part of the online world. And so all of that became really important to capture set against what was clearly happening in the country. But what was happening in the country today, to compare to perhaps what happened in the early 90s, to the 80s, to even a partition, is very different. Because we do have social media, we do have an online world that's constantly influencing and fragmenting the way we consume the information and the truth, right? So all of that became quite, to me at least, important to capture. And we also saw that with the war recently in May. Just this ultimate post-truth era of the videos floating about. I mean, I was speaking more to people that I knew personally in Leh or Kargil about what was really happening than tuning into the news. I mean, a bit of a tangent here, of course, but I think all of these factors for me came together and the book happened.
Sophia is in Mumbai during the Delhi riots in 2020, watching everything unfold somewhat from a distance. And she says, and if I may quote, "Am I really allowed an opinion when I trickle into a bar near Gateway after protests with similarly liberal friends for a bottle of wine, while Medha was on the ground getting beaten up? Was I allowed my despair when I was cushioned behind the protection of a computer screen, sitting safely in my flat, waiting for the world to collapse?" End quote. And I think you've brilliantly captured the paralysis of watching violence unfold while feeling powerless to act, and the tension between wanting to engage and not knowing how. Could you talk a little bit more about this and how you see the novel engaging with that specific feeling?
I think it just speaks to the previous point I was trying to make. I mean, I think this is a very specific feeling of powerlessness that permeates a certain kind of psyche. I think a lot of people may have an inflated sense of what they're doing for the quote unquote movement. And perhaps there is a certain sense of jadedness attached to it, which could be due to my actual lived location in the country that I think has permeated into the character, because the character is also perceived as Muslim. So there is a certain cynicism after the 10, I mean, it's easy to say last 10 years because that's when things really rose to the surface, but I think it's always sort of simmered in the background. And of course, part of the reason where she can even pontificate is because she has that distance, right? I have never personally been in a physically violent situation because of my religion. So I didn't want to write about that particular experience because I just felt it would be inauthentic, which is not to say that writers can't do that. Just for me, I felt like it would be more resonant for my character to go through this while she's consuming all this media, sitting away, but still quite close enough. She still has some stake in what's unfolding and what's playing itself out. I've spent some time in Beirut briefly and grew up briefly in the Middle East. And I think a lot of what I've experienced of young 20 somethings in conflict ridden areas is that there's a very specific relationship to escapism, naturally, because it's quite difficult to imagine stability of any kind where you don't really know what tomorrow would be like. I mean, of course, there's systemic instability, which is economic and sometimes quite literally physical instability, right? And a threat to your bodily autonomy and so on. And I guess there's aspects of that heavily exist in Berlin as well, given its particular history as well. But I think, and of course, it goes hand in hand, right? That I do think in certain areas of conflict or when there's a certain kind of disenchantment with the system, people try to find like counter ways of being, whatever that looks like. Usually, a culture that's more geared towards the nightlife can be places of more acceptance and more freedom, at least in the Middle East. A lot of, let's say, someone being queer will be something that will be more open or accepted in the nightlife culture as opposed to any other kind of microcosm of society there, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but I wanted to bring in these contradictions of perhaps what it means to be in your 20s in a very politically unstable system, especially for minorities, and what that really does to someone's psyche. Because if you grow up with even just the threat of violence, it very specifically changes the way you approach the world. And for a young person, for me, it was quite important to capture that because I think that reaction is quite fluid. It can go from listlessness to even someone being radicalized to being rule following. I don't think it remains static, actually. So in this particular book, it was nice for me to explore certain aspects of Sophia's character, which were more to do with this paralysis she feels, as well as a certain jadedness, because she doesn't particularly see hope, and then it kind of becomes almost my job as an author to find that hope in the novel or in the story. And I think I do and quite naturally emerge with their friendship. But outside of that, not just from a religious point of view, but also the struggle of being an artist in this country, especially if you're an outsider. What does that mean? Or being a woman, really? It sounds like the lowest hanging fruit, and a lot of people have dismissed it as sort of like, oh, not a gender issue again. But I just wish things were different, and then it wouldn't be an issue anymore. But that isn't the case. So I feel like through all of these lenses, because she is somebody who tends to think about things quite deeply and doesn't easily believe. Like she's not buying it, essentially. So I think that sense of inquiry or lack of trust is actually a product of growing up being perceived a particular way in a country that clearly is sending you messages overtly that it does not like you. It does not like who you are. So I think that does something quite particular to someone's psyche, especially a young person. And for me, it became important to capture that, including the sense of paralysis, which is the first time I think she's actively trying to engage with the politics of it all, but for just a mere individual, what does that look like? I mean, I still find that to be better than like I said before, an inflated sense of involvement, which perhaps comes from rationalization or an intellectual discourse or a complete removal, right? Where you're just in kind of denial about what is happening in the country. Yeah, so I think it's the first time she's trying to engage, and of course, she does it in this very imperfect manner.
Born to a Hindu mother and a Muslim father, Sophia's childhood is shaped by this constant negotiation, it seems, balancing conflicting beliefs and witnessing the breakdown of her parents' marriage at the same time. Her Muslim identity becomes, as you note, both a shield and a burden, something that makes her feel like an outsider, even in spaces she should belong to. And there's that striking line where she says she's, quote, sidelined as the bad Muslim, a misfit, the opposite of a model minority, cancelled by the right and now probably cancelled by the left. It's one of the most powerful threads in the novel, right? Sophia's struggle to be seen beyond the assumptions made about her religion, especially in a country that's increasingly hostile. Could you talk to us more about this aspect?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one because, again, for the character, she, as much as she's aware of the fact that, she's on the outside of things because of her location, it's not something she sort of actively engages with in that. And I think an author had said this to me recently, actually, while we were discussing the novel, that being Muslim is not a 24/7 job, right? Like you don't wake up and you're not performing your identity in front of the mirror or for the world. And I think people tend to forget that sometimes. And I think this is a mistake we all make, where A, we try to paint it as some sort of monolith when it clearly isn't. B, we have a very specific sense of what a Muslim person should be perhaps even talking about or writing about or engaging with, and a lot of it evolves the idea of a minority being kind of almost a site of spectacle. Like, we don't want to believe a minority story until there's suffering attached to it. Well, believe or pay attention to. You can put it either way. And of course, a lot of this we have seen play out on a global stage in the last year and a half, where we've sort of seen Western media do what it does best and just reduce like brown bodies to statistics and numbers. And, we're not, anybody who's been paying attention is not surprised by it. But I think that for me was a very particular thing to make sure of, that at no point am I making her, like Sophia, a mouthpiece for my own politics. I was very sure that she has her own identity, that she will naturally have a very contradictory, fluctuating relationship with, because identity isn't static. And I wanted to make sure I got into the nuances of that. I think there has been one review in particular that absolutely hated this approach and, really believed that the politics should have been the subject and not her coming of age or her. But for me, that it was never really about that. Like, I was not writing the book to make a statement. I was writing a book to tell a story about a character that I found entirely compelling, because she's not compelling because her otherness is what defines her. To me, she's compelling because of literally everything else. Like, her being Muslim is the least interesting thing to me, right? But it's very interesting to a lot of other people. But I feel like it serves their narrative. And yeah, I just don't write fiction like that. So it's very interesting. It's like ruffled some feathers actually, and like made some people quite upset, from at least from what I could tell from one or two reviews. And at the same time, it's had an overwhelming response where a lot of young women in their 20s, early 30s have resonated with it so deeply. And I think that in itself is like quite telling, because the personal is political. We've always known this. Cinema has exploded, writers have exploded. A lot of their work just isn't taken seriously until much later. And then it's like Liz Spector, for example, right? Or Shirley Jackson. And then it's a bit like, oh, actually, everything she wrote about did speak to a political moment in history, but we only realize that like 30 years later. So I think all of these things have also emerged in retrospect for me. I think when I was writing it, it was really very much just about following this journey to its like rightful conclusion for this character, because again, it was a very compelling character that very naturally took me to places.
There's a moment in the novel where Sophia is at a film festival in Beirut and she finds herself reflecting on, like you mentioned earlier, the trauma of growing up in war torn countries and the creativity that pushes through under restriction. And in contrast, she feels like her work is a sham. And this speaks to what you just mentioned, right? Because later, during a fellowship, she's told that her script isn't Muslim enough, that it doesn't say enough about the minority struggle, or that it's pandering to the male gaze. To me, this is such a striking commentary on how artists are boxed in, right? They're expected to produce a particular kind of story or to perform their experience in a way that fits an external narrative. It made me think about the limits placed on creative freedom, especially when your identity becomes the primary lens through which your work is received. Could you tell us more about how you wanted to explore that through Sophia's experiences and whether it also reflects some of what you've encountered in your own journey as a writer and filmmaker?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting one, right? While on one hand, I understand the need to perhaps like box creative work into, women's literature or queer literature or written by a Muslim, whatever, man, woman. I think beyond a point, I just find it all quite like I'm like the only narrative it's serving is like an external narrative. It's allowing you to sell books, it's allowing you to perhaps find readers. I just think that legitimacy to something, and let's say in this particular case, the craft of writing, can't be lent on the basis of her identity. Like, surely there's got to be more factors at play than just someone's identity. If you're just talking about artistic merit or work to grant credence or legitimacy to a kind of narrative, right? I think this constant narrativization of only a certain kind of minority story selling, especially abroad as well, with a few titles to that name too, that I mean I won't get into, but really again just speaks to a very one specific kind of experience, right? Like it's almost like making that digestible for perhaps an audience that doesn't have the means to engage deeper with a particular character. You know what? I'll give you an example. Like recently, I read this book this year called The Coin by Yasmin Zahar. Brilliant book about a wealthy, super wealthy Palestinian woman in New York, disenchanted with New York, and of course, her identity is kind of the lens. That's naturally the lens through which she experiences everything, but it doesn't lead with that. It leads with so much else, right? And it is about displacement and losing your homeland and so on, and this twisted relationship you have with a country that's colonized you, but you call your home. But again, it does not lead with that. And I just feel that in any case, if a writer's location is of a particular kind, and if they're able to approach the narrative with a certain sensitivity and with their eyes open, then I suppose it will inform and color everything they write. I'm really like opposed to this idea that we really need to see minorities struggle to buy into a narrative that they're suffering. It's a bit like, I don't know, I find it quite exploitative as well, if I'm being honest. It's almost a trend people are latching onto, right? Like the other day, someone told me that they were like, oh, I wonder if I would have a career if it wasn't for like, they're anti the government, of course, but they were very much like, oh, I wonder if I would have a career actually if it wasn't for the current government. And of course, they were saying it in a funny manner and so on. And so I think that there's just so many contradictions within this conversation as well. Representing people in a manner, in a particular way, I think only seeks to soothe a certain liberal idea of what people like that are. And I suppose when you're writing and you're just trying to write a story, and in any case you do belong, to that particular community, you don't think of it as a Muslim novel. Like, it's not like I was like, oh, let me write a Muslim story. Like, I don't think anyone is approaching it that way. I think it just seeks to kind of satisfy a very external idea of what a story from a particular community should be like. And I think a lot of really good writers just don't do that world over. And which is why we still have a lot of amazing work. The Coin being one of them, of course.
The novel is set at the height of the Me Too movement. And there's a chapter where Sophia is asked to speak out about an incident of sexual harassment on a film set, which she didn't quite witness. And also, she reflects back on a personal experience of harassment, one she can't bring herself to share, even with her close friend. It made me think about how the novel seems to reflect a certain disillusionment with some of the left liberal narratives around patriarchy and justice. It captures the darker edge to the cultural celebration of women breaking the silence, but there's a burden and expectation that women must repeatedly explain their victimization just to be believed or heard. Could you tell us more about how your novel responds to this tension?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head really within your question. I wanted to explore what is the fallout if a character does not rise to the moral requirement of a moment. I think that's exciting to me, right? As opposed to a character, especially a woman in this case, who's always doing the right thing. Although it could be really nice to have a narrative like that and get subverted right at the end. I think a good example of this is, of course, Jean Delmont, which is the super famous film. But no, in my particular novel, I guess somewhere the thinking was, how many men do we know who've actively shielded predators in their circles or continued friendships with men who've been actively accused, or men who've been accused and the world's forgotten about it and they're still in positions of power and they're celebrated and they tweet and people retweet. I mean, Me Too frankly feels like a blip at this point. I was around when Me Too happened, right? I must have been, I want to say in my mid to early 20s around that time. And it felt very powerful, but I don't think it amounted to much in India, to be honest. And in this particular scenario, I mean, she's hardly a social justice warrior in any case. That isn't one of her defining characteristics. If anything, she is very anti that sort of armchair philosophizing and such. But yeah, I just wanted to put her in a tricky situation where morally something is required of her and she's just unable to rise to it. And of course, she has her own beliefs and concerns and contradictions around it. But essentially, she just does a very selfish thing, right? Like, she's friends with this person who may or may not be accused of something. And how does she react to it? And yeah, and somewhere I just didn't really think of gender. I just thought of a person who's self serving, which is like a lot of people we know during the movement and after who continued to support and prop predators up. And that was it. One could read and judge and be like, oh, that is terrible. And one could even understand the compulsions or why she perhaps acted that way without giving too much away about the book, of course. But then that's kind of it, right? Like, I would like to believe that it's a chapter that compels people to engage with it on a slightly more almost moralistic, deeper level, where you're sort of maybe exploring your own moral compass a little bit. I think just like any kind of movement, it's imperfect and Me Too was super necessary. I just don't think it had the intended effect that we really think it did. It may have assuaged some sort of very superficial fire in people, but I don't think systemically it led to that much change, but still it's better than nothing. So it was important for me to write a character who does exist a little bit in the moral grays, because just purely from a dramatic writing level, that's more exciting to me, just to see what emerges.
Alina, one of the things I found really moving in the novel is how it explores Sophia's complex relationships with the women in her life, especially her mother, her childhood best friend Sonia, and her closest friend Medha. The conflict between Sophia and her mother carries this weighted distance. And the female friendships in the novel are written with a kind of rawness that's rare. It's not filtered through the feel-good cliches and tropes, but shown in all its messiness and intensity. For example, we see this tension in the trip to Spiti, where Sophia and Medha finally confront each other, and the scenes from Sonia's wedding in Chennai. Even in your short film Leela, which I hope I get the opportunity to watch one day, I believe there's a similar emotional charge in the friendship of two young women. What draws you to capturing this dynamic of female friendships in both your writing and in your films? And do you see any overlap in how you approach them across the two forms?
I've never really thought about this actually. What draws me to write about this? I think the book, there's a lot of just straight up romance that I've written as well, written into the story in just this very particular jaded manner of Sophia, of course. But there's definitely sort of her relationships with multiple men and such. But to me, I really felt like her relationship with Medha is the emotional engine of the story and what really grounds the story. And to be honest with you, I don't think I could answer what draws me to writing about this. It is kind of a repeat feature of a lot of the stories I write. Even the story I'm currently working on, it's a short story. It's about a young girl and her relationship with her aunt. So yeah, there is definitely a pattern. I don't know actually, because I think it could be one of two things. It could be one that the women in my life have influenced me to a very large degree, from having a fairly rocky relationship with my mother to now having to always having a very strong bond to now finally kind of understanding where she comes from, and she's quite a renegade in her own way. I think seeing that, but not sort of in this poster friendly matriarchal way that we prefer, but in her own particular peculiar way that I've come to learn and understand over the ages. And to now finally like understanding perhaps to a large extent the person she is or the choices she makes, to of course seeing the women in my life, right, like the friends I have and how they choose to live. I just find the minutiae of a woman's lived experience, like the daily ins and outs, just so much more interesting than anything else. To me, it's very revealing. It says a lot about society, systems. I do think it's the sex where people tend to project a lot on, right? Like, I think there's a lot of projection going on constantly. Like, either you're expected to play a particular role or you really can't like get away from certain molds. There's a certain performative aspect to it, which is not to say that men don't have to do that, but that's for another book perhaps. So yeah, it was interesting for me to see what are these spaces where women or girls get to shed all their skin. They get to just like let it loose, whatever that looks like. And I think that confrontation in chapter 9 to me is very indicative of that. I mean, it's hardly anything to do with the trip and everything that's gone wrong in the trip, but so much to do with, like, I feel like the anger is primordial to the point where it isn't even really about each other, but it's about the systems they both have to operate in. But they end up taking it out on each other because where else would they go? It's still that's actually the safest space they know. And so these sort of tensions and contradictions with what it just means to be a woman or to be growing up, I find it so interesting, actually. I feel like this is what I'm going to write about for the rest of my life, probably. It's just that the decade will keep changing. Yeah, so I couldn't say what really draws me to it, but I suppose it's all the maneuvering women have to do just to simply exist. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of work. Like, imagine if you were just a man and you didn't really have to maneuver so much. The world just looks very different when you're constantly maneuvering so much. But it makes for really interesting stories. So, yeah.
The novel also captures how people are grappling with a loss of identity and self-belief in the age of social media. Sophia touches on how it's almost second nature to share mental health struggles publicly, but to also joke about it, and how self-care has taken on a kind of hollow and even sinister tone, and how exhausting it is to live in a world where we're constantly being perceived online. Again, I think there's also the pressure that artists and writers face, right? To not only make the work, but to package it and perform it for an audience. There's a great line where Sophia says, it's not enough to make a painting anymore. You have to record the process on a time lapse, write a clever caption, use all the right tags, and post it at the exact right time of day so that it gets the most traction. Can you perhaps talk a bit about what it's like to navigate that, both personally and through Sophia?
Yeah, thanks for such a close reading of the novel, actually. Yeah, just thanks for that like deep attention. It's very interesting because I guess I can only speak for myself, but at least most artists I know, not just writers, but also visual artists, performance artists, there's a certain desire for privacy and solitude, right? Like, I do think that's when the best creative work happens, when there isn't the pressure of being perceived, and preferably no one's even looking at you until the work's done. No one even knows you're creating the work. Like, that to a lot of people is the idea, including me, is the ideal scenario, which is why you have like notoriously private writers, right? Like, you don't really, Alina Ferrante, we literally don't know her identity. But that's the dream, I think. I just think that it's increasingly impossible to do that now. I think that anonymity and sense of anonymity, I suppose, existed for a reason, so that you could. I think I've said this in one of the interviews that I really do believe that the most interesting work that I'm capable of creating will only happen when you have this sense of abandon where you're like, oh, I actually don't know if this book will be read by anyone, or if this will get picked up by anyone. And that is oddly liberating because for me, at least, I'm not bound by other people's expectations of what a story should be like or what a character should be like. So I can take the most amount of risks in my story and in my narrative and really kind of, because no one's looking or watching, right? So really just experiment and fail and see what emerges. And that to me is extremely exciting in the process, which is why actually, as much as I'm so grateful that I get these platforms to market the book and I get to reach so many people, it's this constant kind of duality. It has also definitely morphed my relationship to writing, at least currently. I feel like I'm not going to be able to fully immerse myself into another story while I'm still doing promotions for this book. Because I do think that writing or any kind of artistic discipline, of course, demands a kind of rigor and invisibility until you're kind of ready to, approach the world with your work. At least that's how I see it. Like, apart from a few trusted individuals, I don't like to show my work prematurely, which is why I don't like maybe send across so many short stories to journals. I just really like to take my time with everything because when did this churn happen? This constant churn of content. I feel like I don't really need to contribute to that. So that's one in terms of if I had the opportunity, I would not be on Instagram. I definitely have the most abusive relationship with it. It's also gotten to a point where like, let's say people you're working with we're just on each other's socials now, which is very interesting because it was not like this in my early mid 20s where we were just putting up photos of like breakfast or, it was just a photo sharing app. That's how it began. And now it's a business. Like people's entire livelihoods are contingent on it, including mine in so many ways. So I can't even be dismissive of it. But I do think it takes a massive toll on like my relationship to work, my mental health. Yeah, it's a very double-edged sword actually. The other day I was talking to a friend and I was trying to make the argument of like wanting to get off social media. And I was like, but like Olga Tokarczuk's not on it. And he was just like, yeah, but she has a Nobel. Like, you need to be on it right now. So I understand that as well. And I think very similar things apply to kind of Sophia, right? Where she's hyper tuned to this reality, but it's a very curated reality. And it's not a substitute for actual reality. And that constant negotiation can really be taxing, of course. She's very much a product of that time, of the time of social media. And I wanted to weave in as much of that as possible into who she is, because I think it's very real. Anybody kind of ignoring that when they're writing about 20 somethings is, I suppose, lucky to even be able to ignore it. I'm unable to write anything these days like that doesn't immediately reflect this very particular reality. I mean, and there's a book by Tony Talatimote called Rejection that explores the online world. And in his particular case, it's people who are chronically online or sort of incels to rejects, and that's why the word rejection. People who just feel rejected by mainstream society. But I think even just a regular person in the mainstream, their experience of daily life is deeply impacted by how social media functions. And therefore, you'll see in the novel that there's scenes which are playing out in a very sort of outward manner, and then suddenly you're in her head, and it is punctuated by certain things that perhaps she's seen on the phone, because I think that's all of our realities now to a point where we've accepted it and internalized it. I think Tokyo is such a good example of that. Like, I've just been observing here in terms of how, like, on public transport and such, every young person, and a lot of young people, like teenagers and young 20 somethings, is playing games on their phone. Like, everyone. I've not even seen a single person like watching a movie or something on their phone or interacting. So it's very interesting and disturbing, if I'll be honest. Because I'm so much older, like there's easily more than a decade's gap between me and a teenager. But I do think it's like, in so many ways, Tokyo is like 10 years ahead of the rest of the world. And it really does feel like very much the future, where people are turning to a kind of curated reality they feel like they've got some control over, because current reality with climate change, with the political scenario, feels increasingly disorienting to contend with.
At the heart of Sophia's story is the question of belonging to a person, a place, or a community, whether that's her industry, her family, her partners, or friends. And she's constantly trying to find where, or even if she fits in. She moves across cities, and with each place, there's a kind of restlessness. Her decisions feel impulsive, but behind them is this clear and deep and desperate search for belonging or grounding. And by the end of the novel, something shifts. She begins to realize that home is not about a place, but about choosing to belong to oneself. Could you tell us more about the growth that Sophia goes through? And what kind of life maybe you imagine her living after where the book leaves off?
Yeah, I think that was an easy one for me, actually, strangely enough. I mean, I struggled with the exact mechanics of the ending, of course, but the last quarter of the novel came quite easily to me, strangely enough. But it was quite clear that after kind of like searching for something, and it's quite a classic as well, right? Like, at least spiritually speaking, and I think that's what a lot of religion talks about as well. Like, after searching for something externally for so long, it was quite natural that that absurd search that sort of informs literally 90% of the novel kind of led her back to herself, right? Where I suppose it's not that she suddenly finds all the answers or all her existential anxieties have been alleviated, but I think it was more to do with being able to just accept who she is, where she's at in that current moment, and how to be comfortable with that truth, right? So I think it was about her kind of arriving at that. I think I would want her to definitely be, I mean, it sounds trite and also sound like a mother somehow, a happy person. But I just feel like knowing her, she will like kind of bring that sense of inquiry and not easily buying into anything, and kind of, truly being her own person, even when she's completely mistaken or wrong, I think is an impressive feat in a world that does demand compliance on every level, right? Especially of a woman. Yeah, so I would hope that she would just be happier, but definitely retain that aspect of herself.
And finally, I want to talk about one of your newsletters, if that's okay, from last year, where you reflect on coming out of a writing hiatus, moving to Delhi, and getting the book deal. You write about how many factors go into making the book possible: luck, timing, talent, hard work, and how hard work is really the only thing you have any real control over. But what really struck me was what you say about how nothing prepares you for how alienating getting a book deal can be. The burden of perceived success and also the pressure of presenting yourself as an author. And you also make this interesting observation about the differences between fiction writers in Delhi and fiction writers elsewhere. Something I'd love for you to also expand on. But what has this journey been like for you? And what advice would you share with a fellow young writer who's just getting their first book deal?
I mean, I'm still quite wet behind the ears, really. Like, the book came out in Jan. So I'm sort of literally like learning on the go, right? Learning on the job, as they say. At least the people I've come across, and now myself included, to be honest, because I live in Delhi too, and I did move to Delhi to, well, for many reasons, to be fair, but in one way to be closer to like the industry, perhaps, that I'm a part of, because it felt like this big bad world from the outside, as it often does, and now it really doesn't. It just feels like, yeah, another thing you have to kind of negotiate and maneuver. I mean, historically, artistic industries are not that kind to outsiders or newcomers. I, of course, got really lucky with the team that I work with, my editor, my agent, publicist, everyone at Westland. I think I've had it quite easy, actually, compared to a lot of the stories I hear about debut authors and such. And I suppose this is just the result of any kind of art having a commercial aspect or pursuit to it, right? Like it's sort of inevitable. It's bound to happen. Yeah, but this self-awareness that you are a marketable artist or you're making someone money or people are buying your books is very interesting. And I mean, I'm still kind of calculating and sort of trying to understand how it may have changed my psyche as literally a writer who like only exists in obscurity. You know, I've always kind of existed in obscurity and written, even writing for screen, which is something I've done, of course. You're really just serving like the director's vision. You're not the hero of the show, right? So to speak. You're just sort of a tool in realizing a much larger picture. Whereas with a novel, that's not the case. Like now, people associate the story with me, people who've read it. To the point where some people like over identify, right? Because there are certain biographical markers which are common. So it's a very much like, oh, you are like Sophia. And I'm like, okay, I wish it was that straightforward, but it isn't. So, and that's where fiction comes in. But yeah, I think just the self awareness can be a little crippling. And it speaks to my earlier point as well that I do think the most interesting work happens when no one is looking. And for me personally, as a writer, it has affected the way I write. Haven't been able to write with that much enthusiasm or abandon since the book came out. But that could also just be like pure creative depletion, right? Because I worked on the novel for so many years, like 6 years physically, and then before that, it was kind of just marinating in my head as well, that it completely makes sense as to why there's that sense of depletion now. But yeah, I think my advice to like young authors would be to somebody just getting their book deal would be to like really shield their sort of inner life, I think, that kind of private life or whatever fulfills them artistically, because it's certainly not this. Like, publicity is not what's going to fulfill me artistically, right? That's just sort of the truth. And to really still be able to pursue that, for me, it's things to do with, I don't know, a certain spirituality or maybe travel. Or solitude. I think that's a big one. I mean, writers have been saying that since time immemorial. But yeah, to not like let go of that and just to be really patient actually, because I mean, every step of the process requires so much patience, which I think you inevitably have if you are a writer because you've gone through that rigor of trying to write a novel. But yeah, just to be patient with yourself as well. I think my agent says a lot about like doing the grunt work and yeah, I do. I think there's some merit in that because at least I have the privilege of being someone who is like comfortable speaking publicly and talking to people. And but a lot of people I know who are writers are introverts and do have a lot of like actual anxiety when it comes to public speaking and such. So I think in that scenario, just going easy on yourself and recognizing what are some aspects you want to engage in and what are some aspects you don't. I think it's okay to like make those distinctions. A writer said this to me, much senior writer, after one of my launch events, where he was like, yeah, just like write every day. Because you think you're working, but you're not. Like your only work is to write. And I'm like, that makes a lot of sense actually.
Thank you for sharing that. That's all really great advice. And Alina, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you, and I really hope to see more of your writings, films, and novels out in the future.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for taking the time out. And yeah, this is for reading the novel with so much attention and care. It means a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. And while you're at it, please do also check out Himal's State of South Asia podcast, hosted by Associate Editor Nayanthara Narayanan, featuring conversations on pressing social and political issues from across South Asia. Himal is also bringing you a new podcast series, Partitions of the Heart, by the priest activist Harsh Mandar. So please tune in to Season 1, which brings you his conversations on the crisis facing India's Muslims amid the rule of the Hindu right. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian writing and ideas like no other. And that gives us a very unique community viewpoint and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to support our work, please do become a paying Himal patron for just $5 a month. We have a great program with lots of perks, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic Southasia Review of Books community. Thanks again, and until next time.